Let me start by asking you what was the most surprising or shocking aspect of this war for you?
For me, the most shocking aspect of this war is the fact that Russian soldiers are behaving not just in a similar manner, but in precisely the same manner as the Red Army behaved in 1944 and 1945 when they conquered Central and Eastern Europe. They are coming into towns and they are murdering and arresting mayors. They are using random violence against civilians, and they are putting people in concentration camps and deporting some of them back to Russia. This is exactly what was done in the Sovietization, the destruction of the societies of Poland, of the Baltic states, of Romania, and of other countries in the years after the Second World War. So we're seeing a repeat of old behavior, and that to me is very shocking.
Soviet Union always was allowed to get away with its crimes. Division of Poland in 1939, occupation of Baltic states, Finland, and even after World War II, Putin puppet communist governments in Europe, occupation of Eastern Berlin, invasion to Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Afghanistan, and now Russia does exactly the same.
The Soviet Union got away with its crimes because it was perceived as a victor in the war, and because in 1945 nobody was willing to push back against them. There was a sense that the war was over. The Americans wanted to go home. Germany was in ruins, and there just wasn't either the energy or the ability really to push back against Soviet power at that point. We're now in a very, very different world. We're in a world where the United States and Europe are united, and they are united with the goal of preventing Russia from destroying Ukraine. So it's a much different position than we were in in 1945. But the behavior of the Russian soldiers and clearly the orders from above are really don't acknowledge that change. I mean, it's as if we were in the same world that we lived in back then.
Whether collective West is responsible for their attempts of pacification aggressor Soviet Union and Russia instead of facing and answering it at that time.
So in 1945, there was a slow realization that the Soviet Union was going to be the kind of power like Hitler's power that would require a united Western response. It wasn't clear immediately after the war. It took some time before that was well understood, and before there were Western institutions in place to deal with that. You know, whether the NATO alliance was built, the American bases in Europe were built, and it took many years really to sort that out. So I don't think it's that the West was weak or unwilling. It was really a failure of understanding. Remember that Soviet propaganda it was very powerful and convinced a lot of people in Western Europe and the United States that the Soviet Union was a benign power, that it wanted peace, that it wanted, you know, power and prosperity for the working class. People believed in those kinds of messages and sympathized with them, and therefore they were sympathetic with the Soviet Union, and they were critical of American capitalism and of the political system in the United States and Western Europe. There is still an element of that that's true today. There are still some people in the West who sympathize with Russian propaganda and with Russian power, but much fewer, I would say. Russia doesn't really try to hide what it is anymore underneath a veil of propaganda. It's an aggressive power which seeks to destroy, not just destroy Ukraine, but also destroy the system of, the based on human rights and respect for the rule of law that was created in Europe after the war. And it's very clear now that that's what's happening. I'd say it was less clear in 2014, but it's to many people, but it's more clear now. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's been such a united Western response so far.
We even have that special definition, Russism, mix of Russia and fascist. But in terms of historical science, can we recognize modern Russian regime as a fascist?
I'm one of the people who's always reluctant to use the word fascist because it immediately implies Hitler and the Holocaust, and that has other implications. And I don't like to use it, for example, talking about most Western far-right leaders, even if some of them openly admire Hitler. But I do think that we can compare Russian fascism to Hitler in this narrow sense, that it's an ideology of total domination. It's based on a dehumanization of the enemy. The Russian state doesn't believe that Ukraine exists and thinks that Ukrainians shouldn't exist. So in that sense, it's an eliminationist, genocidal ideology that just sees the only values in the world are those of pure power. And in that sense, it resembles both Hitler's Germany as well as Stalin's Soviet Union. Stalin's Soviet Union, of course, had many of the same attitudes towards Ukraine and towards Ukrainianness as well, and actually enacted genocidal policies towards Ukraine in the past. Hitler might have done so in Ukraine had he had the chance, but he wasn't able to occupy Ukraine for long enough. So I think you can certainly see similar lines and similar connections between modern Russia and the fascist and Soviet ideologies of the past.
From your understanding, is this war for genocide?
I think it's a war with genocidal intentions. In other words, the intention of the Russian forces is to wipe out Ukraine as a state, to eliminate Ukraine, the culture of Ukraine, and alongside that, the people of Ukraine. And that very much conforms to the original definition of the word genocide, which was, of course, created by somebody who was born in what is modern Ukraine. Raphael Lemkin, he was a Polish Jewish lawyer born near Lviv, and his understanding of the word genocide was that it meant the elimination not just of people and human beings, but also of a culture. And certainly in that sense, the Russian assault on Ukraine is genocidal. It's an attempt to destroy Ukraine as a culture and Ukraine as a nation.
I just tried to get Putin's logic. If he wanted to conquer Ukraine and spread his ideas, his Ruski Mir, he simply did something opposite. Now, people even in eastern regions of Ukraine hate him, hate Russia. What is it all for?
I think it's even more than that. I mean, not only has Putin created anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine that will last for generations. He has also destroyed his own army. He has frightened Western Europe. He has persuaded other countries, Finland, Sweden, to want to join NATO. He's created an anti-Russian sentiment all around the world. He's destroyed his country's economy. He's cut off Russia from the world. He's actually forced the exile of tens of thousands of Russians. Tens of thousands of Russians have left the country because of the war. And these are invariably the most educated, the most talented, the people who held important jobs all through the Russian state and through the economy. So he's really and truly undermined his nation. And I think that's what he will be remembered for. So the great irony of this moment is then in trying to make Russia a great nation, he's reduced its economy, he's reduced its power, he's reduced its influence, he's damaged its image in the world, and I think for a very, very long time.
Putin isn't stupid, he's everything but stupid. Why everything went wrong in his plan?
Essentially, Russia's army was a reflection of Russian society. The army was looked on paper like it was wealthy and like it had been modernized. The Russian army had bought new weapons and created new teams and brought new equipment into the country. But who knows how much of that equipment was stolen? And of course, in a hierarchical institution like the army, when a few people at the bottom steal things and then a few people at the next level steal things and they use them to buy dachas outside of Moscow, and one level up, they use them to buy little apartments in Paris, and the level after up that, you have the leaders of the army stealing so much money that they can afford houses in the south of France. And so it was really on paper, it looked good, just like on paper, the Russian economy looks good. Russia looks rich. Russian GDP, for example, is higher than Ukrainian GDP. But in practice, the corruption means that it's nothing like that. The army was much weaker than it appeared. And the Russian economy, there are a few very, very rich people, but Russians are so poor that when they come into Ukraine, when Russian soldiers come into Ukraine, they're jealous that Ukrainians live in houses made of stone and that they have Nutella and they have laptops. So we see that much of what it looks like on paper wasn't true in practice. I think the army is a mirror of Russian society in another way as well. You know, Putin has been very, very good at disorienting people. His propaganda is excellent at undermining the idea that there's anything can ever be true. You know, so whenever anything happens, there's millions of explanations given, and people are left with the sense that they can't know what's true. They can't ever understand anything. And that's a very good tactic for confusing people and creating apathy. And he's created a tremendous amount of apathy, nihilism, and cynicism. But that kind of propaganda is not good at motivating people, because people don't want to fight and die for a state that they find confusing and frightening, but not inspiring. People aren't inspired by modern Russia. I mean, most people, of course, there's some exceptions, but most people don't feel that they're fighting for some grand cause, for a universal cause. They feel they're fighting for the money. They're fighting because they're paid to do it. Sometimes they're fighting because they know that they can steal things if they conquer Ukraine. They can take washing machines and dishwashers back to their wives. You know, and some of them, of course, are sadists, and they get pleasure out of violence. But I don't think you're seeing, even in either among the POWs or in the conversations with Russian soldiers that we've heard taped over telephone lines, you're not hearing people who are really inspired by the glory of Mother Russia. And that is the huge flaw in Putin's modern propaganda.
And now Putin needs a way out from that dead end, something except of using nuclear weapons. Can West offer him something acceptable?
That really depends a lot on him, and it also depends a lot on the Ukrainians. I mean, I think at this point we all understand that Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory brings death and destruction and torture and rape for the Ukrainians who live there. And so it's not as if offering Russia some territory is something really that any Ukrainian leader is going to be able to do. So I think people are beginning to understand that. The question is whether some form of language or some recognition of the status quo or some maybe lifting of sanctions could be offered to Putin in exchange for him backing down. But really what's important to remember is that Putin himself controls the narrative about what means victory and what means defeat. He started this war with a completely different set of aims than he has now, and those aims can change again. I think this is an important thing that we've learned over the last few weeks. And so if Putin decides that, you know, he can declare victory on May the 9th, or even, you know, 2 or 3 months from now, simply because the West has lifted sanctions, then he can do it. He controls this narrative. He can decide what he thinks victory is. I mean, I think at this point, it's not really up to the West to offer him something. I think it's up to him to decide to stop fighting, to accept the borders of Ukraine, and to find some way of selling that to his own people, which he can do because he controls all the levers of propaganda in his country.
Russian culture has attracted people around the globe, and now we can hear voices for its canceling, because culture is also soft power, it's a gentle weapon. In your perception, is it fair?
So I think it's fair to penalize those particular Russians who have supported Putin's regime openly, who have spoken in its favor, and who speak in favor of this rashist, you know, this brutal war in Ukraine. What I hope will not happen is the elimination of an alternative Russian culture altogether. I do hope that there will be another kind of Russia that can speak its mind and can develop itself outside of Russia, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in Turkey and Yerevan and Georgia, which is where so many Russians are now. I would like to see even the existence of Russian institutions outside of Russia, maybe a Russian university, Russian television stations, places where Russians who think differently, you know, whether we call them liberal Russians or anti-Putin Russians or anti-war Russians, are able to gather and speak their minds. I mean, there are a lot of Russian speakers outside of Russia, in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Germany, all over Central Asia. And I would like for them to hear something different than just Putin's television. So I really do hope that one of the things that will happen in the next few years is that Russian opposition journalists are able to form new organizations, whether it's television or broadcasting or radio or websites that are able to reach Russian-speaking Russians either around the world or even inside Russia through the use of VPN and mirror sites and other kinds of technology. So I would not eliminate all Russian culture. I want Russian culture to thrive, but I want it to be a different culture from the one that exists inside the country.
People in Europe and the United States tend to believe that only Putin is guilty and Russian people are simply brainwashed. But we have an example of neighboring Belarus. They have their own bloody dictator and censorship and state propaganda, but they're not obsessed with the idea of denazification. I just wonder why one nations like Belarusians can resist propaganda and others, Russians, are weak at this point.
I don't have a full answer to that. I suspect part of it is that Belarusians do have access to other kinds of things. I know they have access to Polish media, for example. Also, they haven't had the last decade's worth of propaganda pumped into their heads the way the Russians have. Belarusian state propaganda was always much weaker. There were, until pretty recently, until the recent presidential election, there was functioning opposition media in Belarus that had a lot of attention and drew a lot of interest. And so I feel that there were more alternatives there, and it didn't feel until recently like a totalitarian state. Russia is a little bit different. The propaganda is much more sophisticated. It's been going on for a much longer time. And it has mostly attacked not so much Ukraine, but Europe and America. And it's been focused on the idea that democracy is dangerous, that democracy is degenerate, that people in Europe are unhappy, and their lives are undermined by terrorism, by the terrible effect of gay rights and feminism. They're disoriented, they're poor. And Europe has always held up to Russians as an example of the kind of society that they don't want to become. And Ukraine was a kind of appendage that, Ukraine was shown as a European puppet. Ukraine is just a tool being used by the West to make us degenerate too. And this was a really repeated over and over again, and it was shown even in very subtle ways, in the kinds of entertainment the Russians were shown, in the kinds of news items they were shown. And it lasted for really a decade or more. And I think the level of fear is higher in Russia. I think the level of the sense of living in a closed society is higher. And I think all of those have had a different effect on people. I mean, I would add to that, of course, that Russians do have, in living memory, certainly older Russians remember being an empire. And they remember the feeling of imperial strength. And that's, of course, very different from Belarus. And some of the propaganda is designed to evoke those feelings of superiority. And so because they have this different kind of history, Russians might be more susceptible to that kind of nostalgic propaganda. We were a great empire once, and we can be a great empire again. So these are parts of the world where there's different kinds of history and there's different kinds of propaganda. I mean, I think it's important to remember that nobody is, condemned by their DNA to behave in a certain way. These are cultural inclinations, and cultures can change, and cultures do change. I mean, I think Ukrainian culture changed quite a lot over the last 30 years. And I don't want to ever exclude the possibility that Russia could change. One of the reasons I'm so in favor of listening to and enhancing and helping the Russian opposition is that I hope someday their ideas and their way of thinking will be dominant in Russia too.
It seems like it's going to be difficult to Russian people to change their way of thinking and understanding themselves as a best human beings and great nation. What Russians must do to change that way of perception of themselves? So
historically, the biggest changes in Russia have come about after military loss. Whether it was the loss to Japan in 1905, which led to the creation of the Duma and a lot of constitutional changes, whether it was the losses in World War I that led to a revolt among the army, whether it was the loss in Afghanistan that helped lead to perestroika, this is often the source of change in Russia. And so I would say, number one, what has to happen is that Russia has to lose this war. And losing this war will cause, at least among some people, some kind of self-reflection reaction. And so that's the most important thing that can be done right now. The second most important thing is the thing we've already discussed, which is helping and enhancing and making sure that there is an alternative Russia available, that there's another way of thinking about what it means to be Russia. And that's really a task that can be carried out mostly by the Russian diaspora right now.
I know that historians do not do predictions, but what future of Russia you can see from here?
So I really don't do predictions. And the one country I don't like to predict ever is Russia, because, we have several examples in Russian history of everything seeming very, very, very stable for a long time. And then, bang, something happens and there's a revolution or there's a huge change of power. And everything changes. And it happened in 1917 and it happened in 1991. And so it's very risky to predict. So I don't want to predict any big change, but nor do I want to exclude it. There is no indication right now that Putin is in any danger, that anybody wants to kill him or remove him or replace him with someone else. That's certainly not visible to outsiders. But I would also say it's not impossible. So I'm afraid I'm not going to do a clear prediction for you.
Russia gonna lose this war in short-term or long-term perspective?
I also can't predict that. That depends on how fast the new American weapons get into Ukraine, how fast the Ukrainian army is able to use them. I would say looking, right now, it seems that unless there's some change, the Russian army is not doing well. Just speaking on this particular day that you and I are talking on, there's no evidence that the Russians are on their way to some kind of great victory. And a war of attrition is bad for both sides, of course, a long, slow war. But it also, the longer it goes on, the more some military leaders in Russia, at least, and some people in Moscow will have to be questioning whether it's really worth it. And so it's hard for me to see that it goes on indefinitely.
I thank you for doing this interview, and Slava Ukraini! Glory to Ukraine!
Slava Ukraini! Thank you so much.